Greetings, friends around the world. This is Dr. Bob Thiel, and today I want to ask and answer the question, Church of God or Church of Rome? Which one actually has the closest thing to apostolic succession? And I want to focus on what do Roman Catholic scholars actually teach about early church history. I was brought up Roman Catholic, and one of the concepts that you're taught is that the Church of Rome is the faithful church because it's the original church, and that somehow the Apostle Peter passed on something that they call the cathedra or the seat to a person by the name of Linus, and it's been an unbroken succession of popes since the time of Peter. And while that was my perception, that's not totally different than what the Catholic Encyclopedia teaches. For example, it says, it has been seen that Christ not only established the episcopate, the persons of the 12, okay, we won't argue that, all right, that's the apostles. Further, he created in Peter this office of supreme pastor of the church. We in the Church of God do believe Peter had some type of a primacy, but not the way they're quite going to adhere. Early Christian history tells that before his death, he, that's Peter, fixed his residence at Rome, ruled the church there as its bishop. It was from Rome he dates his first epistle, speaking of the name of Babylon, a designation St. John also gave in the Apocalypse. At Rome, too, he suffered martyrdom in the company of St. Paul, AD 67. The list of his successors in the see is known from Linus, Anacletus, Clement, who were the first to follow him, down to the reigning pontiff. The church has ever seen the occupant of the see of Rome, the successor of Peter, in the supreme pastorate. So that's the claim. Is it completely accurate? Before we go further, I'd like to read something from a Roman Catholic priest and scholar about apostolic succession. This is from Richard McBrien, who I have communicated with. He was a professor of theology as well as a Catholic priest for the University of Notre Dame. He wrote, Apostolic succession. In the strictest sense, apostolic succession refers to the doctrine by which the validity and the authority of the Christian ministry is derived from the apostles. In its broader sense, the apostolic succession refers to the relationship between the Christian church today and the apostolic church of New Testament times. Thus, apostolic succession refers to the whole church insofar as it's faithful to the word. So if it's not faithful to the word, it couldn't be the apostolic church or have succession. The witness in the service of the apostolic communities. Understood in this way, the church is not simply a collectivity of individual churches. Instead, it is a communion of churches whose validity is derived from the apostolic message that it professes and from the apostolic witness that it lives. So in other words, saying apostolic succession basically goes from continuing the teachings of the original apostles. And if you don't have that, you don't have apostolic succession. Now, where does the idea come from? There's a couple different places in the Bible. One comes from Matthew 16, where Jesus says to Peter that, I'm the rock, Peter, you're a stone. On this rock, the church will prevail, and the gates of Hades or death will not prevail against it. So the idea is that the church would always continue. And the other idea comes from Jude 3 that says you're supposed to contend earnestly for the faith once for all delivered to the saints. Therefore, whatever succession anyone has, it'd have to be, again, keeping the original faith of the church. I have found, however, when I've done research, both from the Catholics and from non-Catholics, you're going to find that the idea that the Church of Rome had a pope from the beginning just is not there in church history. I'd like to read some statements from Eamon Duffy. Now, he was on the Pontifical Historical Committee. Pontifical Historical Committee. He's a Roman Catholic scholar, and he says, the continuity between Pope and Apostle rests on tradition, not facts, by the way, which stretched back almost to the very beginning of the written records of Christianity. So in other words, it didn't really go to the beginning. It was already well established by the year 180 when early Christian writer, or Catholic writer, Irenaeus of Lyons invoked it in defense of Orthodox Christianity. Irenaeus thought that the church had been founded and organized, I'm reading the quote, at Rome by the two glorious apostles, Peter and Paul, end of quote. and its faith had been reliably passed down to posterity by an unbroken succession of bishops, the first of them chosen and consecrated by the apostles themselves. He named the bishops that succeeded the apostles, in the process giving us the earliest surviving list of the popes: Linus, Anacletus, Clement, Evaristus, Alexander, Sixtus, and so down to Irenaeus' contemporary and friend Eleutherius, the Bishop of Rome, from 174 to 189. All the essential claims of modern papacy, it might seem, are contained in the gospel saying about the rock, which I referred to a moment ago, and Irenaeus' account of the apostolic pedigree of the early bishops of Rome. Yet the matters are not so simple. That's right. The popes trace their commission from Christ through Peter. Yet, for Irenaeus, the authority of the Church of Rome came from the foundation of two apostles, not one, Peter and Paul, not Peter alone. The tradition that Peter and Paul had been put to death in the hands of Nero about 64 was universally accepted in the 2nd century. And their trophies were supposedly in Vatican Hill for Peter, and Paul's in the Via Otiensis, outside the walls of the road to the coast. Yet on all of this, the New Testament is silent. That's right, the New Testament doesn't tell us where Peter died or was buried, nor does it tell us where the Apostle Paul died or was buried. Later, legend would fill out the details of Peter's life and death in Rome. Legend, not facts, not history, not true apostolic tradition. His struggles with the magician, the father of heresy, Simon Magus, his miracles, his attempted escape from the persecution in Rome, a flight which was turned back by a reproachful vision of Christ, the Quo Vadis legend, as he writes it here. And finally, his crucifixion upside down in the Vatican circus at the time of Emperor Nero. These stories were to be accepted as sober history by some of the greatest minds of the early church, Origen, Ambrose, Augustine. But they are pious romance, not history. And the fact is, we have no reliable accounts of either Peter's later life or the manner of his death, or place of his death. Neither Peter nor Paul founded the church at Rome. And again, this is from a Catholic scholar. There were Christians in the city either before either the apostles set foot there. Nor can we assume, as Irenaeus did, that the apostles established there a succession of bishops to carry on the work of the city. For all indications are that there was no single bishop of Rome for almost a century after the death of the apostles. So the Church of Rome did not have this unbroken succession, according to this particular scholar. In fact, wherever we turn, the solid outlines of the Petrine succession at Rome seem to blur and dissolve. Again, this is a Catholic scholar. Neither Paul, Acts, nor any of the Gospel tells us anything direct about Peter's death, and none of them even hints about the special role Peter could have passed on to any single successor. There is therefore nothing approaching a papal theory in the pages of the New Testament. So this doesn't come from the Bible. Furthermore, Duffy continues, there was a strong anti-Roman tradition in the early church. Rome was a harlot city soaked with the blood of saints, the center of which spread out wave after wave of persecution. The book of Revelation's gloating vision of the coming ruin of Rome, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, Revelation 18:4, remained a persistent strand so long as the empire continued to persecute the church and even survived the Middle Ages. Now, what's interesting or disturbing is that there really were no bishops of Rome who titled themselves Pontificus Maximus the first few centuries. Well, that part is not disturbing. The disturbing fact is that they finally did pick that up. Now I'm going to read something from the Catholic Encyclopedia. Mithraism reached its zenith during the 3rd century and vanished under repressive regulations of Theodosius, he was a Roman emperor, at the end of the 4th century. There were 7 degrees of initiation into the Mithratic mysteries. The fathers conducted the worship. The chief of the fathers, a sort of pope, who always lived at Rome, was called Pater Patrum or Pater Patratus. In other words, Pope or Papa. So it was about the time that Theodosius eliminated Mithraism, by the way, that the bishops of Rome took on the title of Pontificus Maximus, or Pontifex Maximus. Now, the Catholic scholar Duffy observed how a shift happened with the Roman bishops. Quote, the Romanization of the papacy was more than a matter of external decoration. Self-consciously, the popes began to model their actions and their style as Christian, so-called, leaders on the procedures of the Roman state. In other words, a lot of the procedures and practices that the bishops of Rome adopted were not original practices. They didn't get them from the Bible. They didn't get them from the apostles. They got them from the Roman state. They got from the Roman state as they were progressing and getting more and more power. But again, it's not biblical. Now, the title Pontifex Maximus had been held by many Roman emperors, including Constantine. And here's something that the Catholic Encyclopedia reported about the reign of Constantine. Could not Sol Deus Invictus, that's the sun god, to whom even Constantine dedicated his coins for a long time. I'll comment on that. Even after Constantine supposedly was Christian, which he wasn't truly, he had coins produced that showed the picture of the sun god on them. Or Sol Mithras Deus Invictus. So again, we've got this Mithraism here again. Venerated by Diocletian Galerius, became the supreme god of the empire. Constantine may have pondered over this. Not only had he absolutely rejected the thought, had he absolutely rejected the thought, even after a miraculous event, which strongly influenced him to favor of the god of the, they wrote Christians like Catholics. As Pontifex Maximus, he watched over the heathen worship and protected its rights. So Emperor Constantine was Pontifex Maximus when he was a sun god worshiper. Well, even though he claimed to have some form of Christianity, he kept the title of Pontifex Maximus, and he still put sun god on his coins. Now, a few decades after he died, when the Roman emperors became more Catholic in their practices, the Roman Emperor Gratian refused the title. Let me read you one report. Pontifex Maximus. Gratian refused the pontifical robe. He was the last Roman emperor to hold that title, for the College of Pontiffs was abolished under Emperor Theodosius in 395. So, probably feeling it was inappropriate to have the term Pontifex Maximus, which basically was the bridge builder between God and man. Basically, that's what the emperors considered themselves. They were sort of a lower deity or a greater human, or actually both. And again, since this was a pagan title, Gratian didn't feel he should take it. But when he dropped it, Bishop Siricius picked it up. Now, he was Bishop of Rome from 384 to 399, according to Lope's Book of the Popes. It says, Siricius was the first to assume the title of Pope from the Greek papa, meaning father. So we see this. Didn't happen until people like Gratian said, I shouldn't be doing this. And the Catholic Encyclopedia wrote the following. The title Pope Papa, it was apparently the 4th century, began to become a distinctive title of the Roman pontiff. Pope Siricius seems to have so used it. And that's the case. But it was not exclusive to the Bishop of Rome, even at that stage. This is from a Catholic, former Catholic priest. It was only in the year 1073 that Pope Gregory VI forbade all Catholics to call anyone Pope except the Bishop of Rome. Before then, many bishops were fondly addressed as Pope or Papa. So the idea that there was one Pope from the beginning in the 1st century to present is simply not the case. The bishops of Rome didn't use the term Papa or Pope until the late 4th century. And again, it was not even exclusive to them until sometime into the 11th century when Pope Gregory VI forbade it. Now, I'd like to go back to Irenaeus' writing about the founding of the Church of Rome. You understand that Irenaeus is one of the most important early historians as far as the Church of Rome is concerned. And there's another one called Tertullian. We'll get back to him later. And here's what Irenaeus wrote. It would be very tedious in a volume like this to reckon up the successions of all the churches. We do put to confusion all those who, whatever manner, in evil pleasing by vainglory or blindness and perverse opinion, assemble in unauthorized meetings. By indicating that tradition derived from the apostles of the very great and very ancient universally known church founded and organized at Rome by the 2 most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul. Also, the faith preached to men, which comes down to our time by means of the succession of bishops. The blessed apostles then founded and built up the church, committed into the hands of Linus the office of the episcopate, or the bishopric. Of this Linus, Paul makes mention of him in his epistle to Timothy. To him succeeded Anacletus, and after him, in the third place after the apostles, Clement was allotted the bishopric. But this idea that Irenaeus is saying this happened by tradition, so first of all, he didn't have any facts, so this was well over 100 years after Peter and Paul were supposed to be dead. He said that Peter and Paul, specifically Paul, had something to do with the naming of the first bishop of Rome, and that contradicts the current teachings of the Church of Rome that basically the Apostle Peter was the one who took care of that in their view. Now, there's another writing I'd like to mention, and this is just a report from a priest by the name of F.A. Sullivan. Now, he was professor emeritus at the Gregorian University of Rome, which I visited one of the last times I was in Rome. And he wrote, Irenaeus focuses on the Church of Rome, which he describes as the greatest, most ancient, and known of all, founded and established by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul. Here we must acknowledge a bit of rhetoric, as the Church of Rome was obviously not so ancient as those of Jerusalem or Antioch, so the Church of Rome was not the original one, nor was it actually founded by Peter or Paul. Now, the Catholic Encyclopedia, in case you think Priest Sullivan's some kind of a rogue priest, which he was not, here's what it reports. Paul would have worded his epistle otherwise if the community addressed, meaning the Romans, even immediately indebted to his apostolate. So they're saying, if the Catholic Encyclopedia is saying, look, if Paul somehow founded the Church of Rome, he would have written his letter very differently. Now I'm going to read from the Reims New Testament of 1582. Now this is a Catholic accepted translation of Jerome's Latin Vulgate translation of the New Testament. So I'm using Catholic translations today to point out to not only Catholics, but to non-Catholics, that even Catholic-supported writings agree with what I'm going to be teaching here. So this is from Romans 15, 20 through 22, and you can somewhat follow along no matter what translation you have, because it'll say something pretty similar to this, or it should. And I have so preached this gospel, this is the Apostle Paul writing, not where Christ was named, lest I should build upon another man's foundation. Verse 21, but as it was written, they to whom it hath not been preached of him shall see, and they that have not heard shall understand. Verse 22, for the which cause I was hindered very much from coming to you. So Paul would not have written this to them if he thought that he had founded it. He's basically saying, look, I would have come here sooner, but somebody else had sort of gotten this going. It wasn't as important, and I'm here. But he didn't say he founded it. So the idea, the claim that he founded it is simply not the case. And again, this is from sacred scripture that people who are associated with the Church of Rome should be accepting. Now, let me read some more about this idea of a bishop of Rome. This is again from Priest Sullivan. It doesn't appear that Paul ever appointed one person as resident bishop over any of his churches. Going further, and by the way, this is from Sullivan's book, From Apostles to Bishops, the Development of the Episcopacy in the Early Church. And by the way, those who want more details, of course you can look those up, or you can actually go to www.cogwriter.com and have an article, What Roman Catholic Scholars Actually Teach or Admit About Early Church History, which is basically where I've got my notes for today's message. Let me read this again from Priest Sullivan. Admittedly, the Catholic position that bishops are the successors of the apostles by divine institution remains far from easy to establish. The first problem has to do with the notion that Christ ordained apostles as bishops. The apostles were missionaries and founders of the churches. There is no evidence, nor is it at all likely, that any one of them ever took up permanent residence in a particular church as its bishop. The letter of the Romans to the Corinthians, known as 1 Clement, and by the way, his titled The Letter of the Romans to the Corinthians is a better description of it, which dates to about the year 96, provides good evidence that about 30 years after the death of St. Paul, the church at Corinth was being led by a group of presbyters with no indication of a bishop with authority over the whole local church. Most scholars are of the opinion that the Church of Rome would most probably have been led at that time by a group of presbyters. So around 96 AD, the belief was that the Church of Rome only had a group of elders essentially ruling different, or leading, but not one person who was ruling all of Rome, let alone all of Christendom, which is the other position that the Church of Rome people seem to believe. There exists a broad consensus among scholars, including most Catholic ones, again this is from a Catholic priest, that such churches as Alexandria, Philippi, Corinth, and Rome most probably continued to be held for some time by a college of presbyters or elders, or priests, in a sense, and that only in the 2nd century did the threefold structure become generally the rule, with a bishop assisted by presbyters presiding over a local church. So again, the idea that there was a pope after Peter, and he ruled over all Christendom, was accepted by everyone, simply the records don't support that. Again, this is according to Catholic scholars. There were simply no known bishops of Rome in the 1st century. The Bible itself says nothing about Rome in terms of its any leadership significance to the true church. And other than Paul's letter to those in Rome and his imprisoned letters from Rome, there's only 3 non-related times the New Testament even uses the term Rome exactly. The first mentions that Jews from Rome and other parts of the world were in Jerusalem around Pentecost. That's in Acts 2:10. And that's probably, by the way, how Christianity spread to Rome. As they were visiting for Pentecost, some accepted the message and repented as the Apostle Peter taught, and they went back to Rome. And that's the most likely way the first Christians got to Rome, and they would have been Jewish Christians. Okay, the second reference is that Claudius had the Jews depart from Rome in Acts 18. And the third involves Onesimus, who visited Rome and then later Ephesus in 2 Timothy. So we don't have other references to Rome with that term. The term Babylon is used a couple times in the New Testament. At least one time it does refer to Rome. The other time I think that's questionable. Now I'd like to read another claim. This is from a Catholic priest by the name of Roderick Vaughan. Catholic Church, founded by Christ, propagated by his apostles from Jerusalem through Asia Minor to Rome as its permanent world center, from which it spread through the world according to the mandate of its divine founder. Now it's absolutely certain that Jesus began the church in the book of Acts around 31 AD. So we know it was in Jerusalem, and then you can read that in Acts 1 and 2. And it's also true that the apostles went from Jerusalem to Antioch and to Asia Minor. That's also completely true. And it's also true that the apostle Paul visited Rome while he was imprisoned in Rome. I guess that's not a normal visit. But it is true that the original leadership of the Church of God was in Jerusalem, then Antioch, then Asia Minor. And while Paul was a leader of the church while he was alive, he was not the top leader. Again, Peter was alive at the same time. So basically, the top leadership of the original apostles was more centered between Jerusalem and Asia Minor for the first couple of centuries of Christianity. Almost 2 full centuries, or approximately 2 full centuries. Now, we in the continuing Church of God do not believe it's possible that one city was appointed to be the one over all of Christendom. We believe that the church had to relocate because of persecution from one town to the other, one city to the other throughout history. And that simply was not the case with Rome. It's been there for close to 2,000 years. I would say more like 1800 or so, 1900 with bishops. But it's basically been a permanent or continuing city. But I'd like to read what the Apostle Paul wrote, because he said that wasn't possible. I'm going to read from 2 Catholic translations. The first will be the Douay-Rheims. This is Hebrews 13, verse 14. For we have not here a permanent city, but we seek that which is to come. So it's likely the Apostle Paul wrote the book of Hebrews, and he's saying, look, we don't on this earth have a continuing city. There's no one city you can look to being the city. Okay, well that kind of causes a problem then for Rome. Now I'm going to read from the New Jerusalem Bible. That's a more commonly used translation by Catholics in the last, let's say, 10 years or 20 years perhaps, maybe longer. And it says, there is no permanent city here for us. We are looking for the one which is yet to be. So again, we get this concept from the Bible that it's not possible that there could be one city that the church should be in throughout history. Some have criticized the Church of God because you say, oh, your church is too new. Look, you people had people in, claim you had people in Ephesus, and you had people in various mountains in Europe, and some people then in England, and you had your headquarters apparently in Rhode Island, and then you guys bounced around all kinds of places in Oregon and Pasadena, California, and whatever. You guys you're not, every time there's a new incorporation, you guys obviously are a new church, because the church shouldn't be bouncing around like that. Well, that might appeal to human reason, but that's certainly not what the Bible teaches. Now I'm going to read Matthew 10, 22 through 23. This is from the Rames New Testament again. And you shall be odious to all men for my name, but he that shall persevere to the end, he shall be saved. And when they persecute you in this city, flee to another. Okay? So don't just stay in one city. And perhaps that's why in Hebrews it said we don't have one city. Now I'm going to read from the New Jerusalem Bible, the same verses, Matthew 10, 22 through 23. You will be universally hated on account of my name, but anyone who stands firm to the end will be saved. If they persecute you in one town, take refuge in the next. If they persecute you in that, take refuge in another. In truth, I tell you, you will not have gone round the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Now, it's consistent with what happened throughout church history. The Church of God, we fled from one place to the other based on persecution opportunities. Heretics within, heretics without, all kinds of things cause the church the headquarters, if you will, or of the Church of God to move throughout history. Now, Jesus has not yet returned, and whatever Christians there were in Palestine, they were chased all through there, and the Crusades basically would have helped ensure that as well. So Jesus was referring to cities to flee to other than just Palestine. And throughout history, as I mentioned before, you'll see the Church of God in places like Transylvanian regions. It looks like we were there for a while, in different parts of the Alps and throughout Europe, and then again up through the United Kingdom, well, what is now called United Kingdom, and then over into Rhode Island and the American colonies, and finally into the which became the United States. So Jesus was prophesying that it wasn't possible that the church would be in one location all the time, and it has not been. Now, another truth that we ought to consider is that the Roman Catholics have something called varieties of order. And you say, what's that? Well, they have different orders for where they think who supposedly succeeded Peter, or in what order afterwards. According to Tertullian, and I'll get back to him later, he said he taught that Peter appointed someone named Clement, and actually that was the basic position of the Latin churches for some time. Yet other writers, probably because of Irenaeus and others, came up with a different list, which finally got adopted now. Now Hegesippus, this is from the Catholic Encyclopedia, says Linus, Cletus, Clement, or Clement. Irenaeus had Linus Anacletus Clemens. Jerome had Linus Anacletus Clemens. The poem against Marcion has Linus, Cletus, Anacletus Clemens. Hippolytus, who is considered the greatest Catholic theologian prior to Constantine, according to one source in the Catholic Encyclopedia, said it was Linus, Clemens, Cletus, Anacletus. And Augustine said it was Linus, Clemens, Anacletus. Now, the Catholic Encyclopedia says, at this present time, no critic doubts that Cletus, Anacletus are the same person. Anacletus is a Latin error. Cletus is a shortened form of Anacletus. So that's the claim. And it says, but it may have been a deliberate alteration by Hippolytus on the ground of tradition mentioned by Tertullian. So they're saying it's possible. Hippolytus wrote roughly 30 years after Tertullian, and says he had Tertullian's records. Tertullian was a lawyer. Tertullian was considered to be accurate, and he says he might have changed his list because of that. But instead of imputing improper motives to Hippolytus, it might simply be he was reporting the truth the way he understood it. And Tertullian and Hippolytus were only two of 5 or 6 major recognized writers between, let's say, 120 after the death of Ignatius to 220 or 230. And the others referenced in these lists are Irenaeus and Hegesippus, and the others are just outside of that period. Now, I'd like to read what the historian and bishop, Catholic Bishop Eusebius wrote, were Hegesippus' words. Quote, "And the Church of Corinth continued in the true faith until Primus was bishop in Corinth. I conversed with them on my way to Rome and abode with the Corinthians many days, during which we were mutually refreshed with true doctrine. When I came to Rome, I remained there until Anacletus, whose deacon was Eleutherus. And Anicetus was succeeded by Soter, and he by Eleutherus. In every succession, every city that it was held, it was preached by the law and the prophets of the Lord." Now, Catholic scholars seem to realize that Hegesippus wrote the original list, but the above account doesn't prove it. It just says that he saw there was a succession back then. Now, I'd like to read something from Priest Richard O'Brien, who was a professor of theology at the University of Notre Dame, and I referred to him earlier. He wrote, "History, the teacher of life, teaches that there were no popes in a modern sense of the word, that is, sole bishop of Rome." And I'll take that a step further. Not only not sole bishop of Rome, but sole bishop of Christendom until the middle of the 2nd century. Until then, the Church of Rome was governed not by a single bishop, but by a committee or council of elders or presbyter bishops. Perhaps one individual was like a convener or chair. The prominent ones may have been the ones whom the Catholic Church regards as the immediate successors of Peter. So he's not sure. And those of us who looked at this try and just look for the truth as opposed to a bias, say, okay, yeah, there's a list there. We saw Linus, Anacletus, Clement, and Everus and other people's names, but they didn't say that they were bishops of Rome. It didn't say a lot of things that were told. And then he says, and we can't be certain. It's significant, for example, that when St. Ignatius of Antioch addressed his famous letters to the bishops of the churches of the Mediterranean world, the letter to Rome was the only one which a local bishop was not mentioned. So when Ignatius wrote the Smyrnians and the Ephesians and such, he mentioned that they had bishops, or he graded the bishop, but not to Rome. Indeed, there's no evidence that Peter himself ever functioned in an episcopal role in Rome. Although traditionally regarded as the founder of the church there, along with the Apostle Paul, Peter was not even present when Christianity first came to Rome in the early 40s. So he's saying that Christianity, the way he understood it, didn't come to Rome until at least the 40s. As I said, I think a few Christians probably came there in the 30s, any who would have repented from hearing Peter. But again, Peter didn't found the church in Rome. Now, interestingly, let me read what the Liber Pontificalis, that's the book of the popes. This was put together 4th to 7th century, depending on which list you look at. It says about Peter and his spiritual successor. He, that's Peter, consecrated Clement as bishop and entrusted the cathedra and the whole management of the church to him, saying, "As the power of government, that of binding and loosing, was handed to me by my Lord Jesus Christ, so I entrust to you, ordain those who are to deal with various cases and execute the church's affairs. Do not be caught up in the cares of this world, but ensure you're completely free for prayer and preaching to the people." Yet the Catholic Church doesn't accept the above because they say that Linus was the one. And one of the reasons this is important is Liber Pontificalis contains a lot of inaccurate information, and a lot of information that we have regarding tradition or legend, if you will, of the early people who were later called bishops of Rome come actually from the Liber Pontificalis. Now I'd like to read something from the preface of the Liber Pontificalis. Some ask, since Linus and Cletus were bishops in the city of Rome before this Clement, how could Clement himself have this? Now we've heard this explanation that Linus and Cletus were indeed bishops in the city of Rome before Clement, but during the lifetime of Peter. That is, they undertook the care of the episcopate, that he fulfilled the office of the apostleship. So what they're saying is, all right, maybe Clement was really appointed to be the apostle's successor, but he didn't really do much at the time. And there were other bishops who kind of ran things. First Linus and then Cletus. But again, that differs from what's commonly taught in terms of how the Church of Rome supposedly has its authority. Because if the Church of Rome does not have authority from the apostles, which it does not have direct authority from the apostles, and I guess I should comment here, I read the statement originally that from Priest O'Brien that apostolic succession occurs when you're true to the teachings of the original apostles. There's an article at the cogwriter.com website called "Who is Faithful?" The Church of the Continued Church of God, or the Roman Catholic Church. If you read Catholic writings, you're going to find out that they admit that they've changed, that they don't teach the same things a lot of the early saints taught. And many of those doctrines are held by the Continuing Church of God. We still teach what the original church taught. And again, I don't have time in today's sermon to go through that. But if you want to go through that your own, you can go to cogwriter.com and check this out for yourself. And again, these are primarily going to be Catholic sources or Catholic approved sources that I've cited to demonstrate what the original teachings were that the Church of God still has, and that the Church of Rome no longer has. Now, I'd like to again read from Priest Sullivan. It says, "We must conclude that the New Testament provides no basis for the notion that before the apostles died, they ordained one man in each of the churches they founded. Was there a bishop of Rome in the first century?" This again from a Catholic priest. "The available evidence indicates that the church in Rome was led by a college of presbyters rather than a single bishop for at least several decades of the second century." So since Jesus died around 31 AD, and Peter probably died in the 60s AD, some think he may have gone a little longer than that, it wasn't for at least 70 years, probably after his death, and it might have been 80 or 90, that there was actually a bishop of Rome, in the sense that of the way the Bishop of Rome has bishops in other cities now. Again, even when there was the first Bishop of Rome, he was not considered to be the head of Christendom or anything along that line. And certainly not from the time of Linus or Cletus or Clement. Now, as far as Peter, I'm going to read what the Catholic Encyclopedia wrote. It says that Peter founded the Church of Antioch indicates he labored a long time there, and perhaps he dwelt there toward the end of his life. The Church of Rome admits that Peter, toward the end of his life, was in Antioch and had been there a long time. It's also probable he pursued his apostolic labors in various districts of Asia Minor, for it can scarcely be supposed from the entire period between his liberation from prison and the Council of Apostles, he was spent uninterruptedly in one city, whether it's Antioch, Rome, or elsewhere. Peter returned occasionally to the original church at Jerusalem. And that was not easy to do back then. Travel was very laborious and difficult. The date of Peter's death, thus not decided. It's the period between 64 and the beginning of 68. But I find it interesting that the admission is Peter traveled a lot, probably spent a lot of time in Asia Minor, did not fix his residence in any place for any particularly long time. Now let me read again for the Catholic Encyclopedia about Peter. "We possess no precise information regarding the details of his Roman sojourn." So if Peter was in Rome, we don't really have much in the way of evidence. Now whether Peter was in Rome or not, that's not the primary issue. The issue was whether or not there was apostolic succession in Rome, either based on the teachings or based on the leadership. Well, it certainly wasn't from the teachings, because, as I mentioned a few moments ago, the teachings have been changed. And as far as the leadership, this is based on legend that basically cannot be substantiated. And there's a lot of information that actually contradicts it. Now, Hippolytus, who I mentioned before, is considered one of the greatest early theologians of the Church of Rome, said, Peter preached the gospel in Pontus, in Galatia, and Cappadocia, and Bithynia, and Italy, and Asia. That's where Hippolytus, around 220, 210, 230 time frame, said, when he wrote, that's where Peter was. So he didn't say anything about, this isn't talking about Peter being in Rome then. So if Peter spent time in Rome, it wasn't very long. If you can check this out in the Bible from Acts 3, 1 through 11, 4:13, 8:14, Galatians 2:9, it says he was often with the Apostle John. And that's important because the Apostle John spent his time in Asia Minor. And so this is something a lot of people don't realize. The other thing about this is I'd like to read something else. This is from the Catholic Encyclopedia article about the Epistle of Romans. It mentions this about Paul not mentioning Peter. And I would comment that that's a concern that we in the Church of God have raised, that when Peter was alive, Paul wrote the book of Romans. And he mentioned lots of leaders in Rome, but he never mentioned Peter. Encyclopedia says about this, the complete silence as to St. Peter is most easily explained by supposing he was then absent from Rome. Paul may have been aware of that fact. He might be, but another explanation is Peter, if he ever was in Rome, wasn't there long enough to be considered a leader there, or in terms of like a bishop, a permanent bishop. It took a long time to travel back then, and if the Apostle Paul thought Peter was in Rome, was going to go in Rome, you'd think he would have probably mentioned Peter in there, but it didn't. He didn't. It took months from where Paul was to get to Rome. I mean, it was not easy. It was not easy travel. There were not airplanes and trains and stuff like we have. It took a long time. And it was believed that the book of Romans was written around 57 AD. This is according to Nelson's Study Bible. And it's likely that Peter hadn't even been to Rome by that stage. So again, it makes no sense to claim everything is based on Rome. Now, Eamon Duffy, who I mentioned before, who was a member of the Pontifical Historical Commission, observed, Paul's epistle to the Romans was written before he or Peter ever set foot in Rome, a Christian community already in existence. So again, writing probably around 57 AD, and if Peter died in 62 or 67 AD, he wouldn't have been in Rome very long. According to Priest Sullivan, a bishop is a residential pastor who presides in a stable manner over the church in a city and its environs. Then he contrasts that. The apostles were missionaries and founders of churches. There is no evidence, nor is it likely at all, that any of them ever took up permanent residence in a permanent church as its bishop. Well, I would comment for most of them that was probably true until they got older. The only one that we commonly believe died of old age was probably the Apostle John. So it's possible he was in an area for a long time. According to limited information we have, it appears most of the other apostles were probably martyred. But again, there's not a lot of direct evidence of that. So it is possible that maybe some others stayed in some area for a while as they got older. Now what's interesting is that at the time of ancient Rome, Rome was basically filled mostly with Gentiles. Oh yeah, there were a few Jews I mentioned before, but it was pretty much a Gentile community. It was a head of the Gentile world, if you will, at least the western portion of that Gentile world. Definitely not the Far East. But who does the Bible say had responsibility to reach the Gentiles? Was it Peter or was it Paul? I'm going to read Galatians 2, 7 through 8. But contrariwise, when they had seen that to me, that's Paul, was committed the gospel of the presbytery, and as to Peter the circumcision. Therefore he wrought in Peter the apostleship of the circumcision, wrought also in me among the Gentiles. So basically Paul's saying, look, Peter was supposed to be the one reaching the Jews and the other children of Israel, and I was supposed to basically reach the Gentiles. And so you would think, since again Rome was primarily Gentile, that this was not a reference to Peter leading it. This goes against the facts. You would think that the biblical arguments would be supportive of Peter ruling Rome, appointing people and all that type of a thing. And while again, it's true that the apostles appointed others, including bishops, to lead different areas, there is no evidence about this with the apostle Peter in Rome. And again, there are stories that came later, but these stories were embellished, and there were contradictory lists about who supposedly was put in charge after Peter. And it took a long time before people decided to sort this out and decide on one way. But again, the evidence could point the other way, as well as the fact that none of the evidence is absolute proof. There was no early document that says that Peter truly appointed Linus, and that at his death there should be a succession of someone else. Now, Rome, as I mentioned before, simply was not close enough to Asia Minor for Peter to be based out of Rome. And it was seen that it was Asia Minor and Antioch, which is where Peter could have possibly had some type of episcopate. And actually, the book of Galatians specifically mentions that Paul visited Peter on 2 occasions, and both those times were in Jerusalem and not Rome. Why? Because Rome was still not the headquarters of the church. And this is very late in Peter's life. This is clearly documented in the Bible. If you go to Galatians 1, 15 through 18, it says, "But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace, to reveal his Son in me, that I may preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned to Damascus. After 3 years, I went to Jerusalem to see Peter and remained with him 15 days. So right here, Paul's saying, look, yeah, when this stuff happened, I could have gone to see the apostles in Jerusalem, but I didn't. God had me do something else for 3 years. And 3 years later, I went down to Jerusalem, and I saw Peter, which, of course, would suggest that Peter was not in Rome at those times. And then in verse 21, afterward, I went to the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was unknown by face to the churches of Judea, which were in Christ. Galatians 2:1 now. Then after 14 years, I went to Jerusalem again with Barnabas, and took Titus with me. Galatians 2:9. And when James, Cephas, that's Peter, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that had been given to me, they gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship that we should go to the Gentiles. So we saw there was a period of time when Paul got converted. He stayed out for 3 years in Arabia, went to Jerusalem. Peter was there. Then 14 years later, went back to Jerusalem. Peter, James, and Paul were there, and they seemed to be pillars. They were leaders in the church at Jerusalem. Now, what does all this mean? According to the Catholic Encyclopedia, Paul's conversion did not happen until 34 AD. So if you take this time, the earliest possible date for Paul to make his second recorded visit to Jerusalem was 54 AD. That's 3 years plus 17 plus 34. It could have been later, like 57. And from there, Peter told Paul to go to the Gentiles again. Hence, Peter could not have been the apostle of the Gentiles in Rome for all this time, if he ever was. Now, some people say that Peter had the power of the keys, and the Catholic Encyclopedia admits it's comparatively seldom that the fathers, when speaking of the power of keys, make any reference to the supremacy of St. Peter. One of the reasons is that throughout Scripture, a lot of times we see Peter and John as a team. Yes, Peter had a little more, what's the term I want, primacy, if you will, but they were together and they worked together. And let me read from Priest McBrien again. The conferral of the power of the keys of the kingdom surely suggests an imposing measure of authority, given the symbolism of the keys. But there is no explicit indication that the authority conferred was meant to be exercised over others, much less that be an absolutely monarchical kind. In fact, in Acts, Peter is shown consulted with other apostles, even as he was sent by them in Acts 8:14. So in other words, Peter did not act like some bishops or popes of Rome have, which is they've got all authority like this great emperor and king and just do what they say. Anyway, Priest McBrien continues with, he and John are portrayed as acting as a team. Acts 3, 1 through 11, 4, 1 through 22, 8, 14. And Paul confronts Peter for his inconsistency and hypocrisy. Paul opposed him to his face because he was clearly wrong, Galatians 2:11. So Peter was not considered so above everyone that he couldn't be corrected. All have sinned and falling short of the glory of God. No one's perfect, including the Apostle Peter. He was not above all so much that he could not accept correction. Now, even traditions of early Catholic writers do not teach that Peter was given the sole authority over the church. This is from the Catholic historian von Dollinger. Of all the fathers who interpret these passages, Matthew 6:18, John 21:17, of all the fathers, that means the early Catholic accepted writers or historians, basically. Not a single one applies them to the Roman bishops as Peter's successors. How many fathers have busied themselves with these three texts? Yet not one of them, who commentaries we possess, like Origen, Chrysostom, Hilary, Augustine, Cyril, Theodoret, and those interpretations are collected, drop the faintest hint that the primacy of Rome is a consequence of the commission and promise to Peter in Matthew 16. Not one of them explained that the rock of foundation which Christ would build his church at the office was given to Peter, was to be transmitted to his successors, but understood they understood the confession about the rock as either Christ himself, and that is the correct way to understand it, or Peter's confession of faith. Just the fact that, Peter, you said the right thing, this is good. It's believing in Jesus that some thought was the rock, or Jesus being the rock. And again, these are from early Catholic accepted writers. They didn't say that, it meant, Peter, you are in charge forever. That was simply not a belief or practice. It wasn't until quite late that the Roman Church decided that Peter was its first bishop. Now, I'm going to read this from regarding Stephen I from 254 to 257. He seems to have been the first pope, they didn't call themselves pope yet, to have appealed to the classic "You are Peter" text in Matthew's Gospel as a basis for Roman primacy. Peter was not regarded as the first bishop of Rome until the late 2nd or early 3rd century. And I think it's definitely, he was not considered the first bishop for a while, although you could say that, again, in Tertullian's writing, which I'll get to, he alluded to that, but again, that's close to the beginning of the 3rd century. It needs to be understood, but as far back as the late 2nd century, both Irenaeus and Tertullian taught some version of apostolic succession occurred in areas other than Rome. Furthermore, even in the 21st century, the Roman Catholic Church recognized the legitimacy of the Church of the Eastern Orthodox, based in cities such as Constantinople, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, were founded by somebody other than the Apostle Peter. Tradition says they were founded by the Apostles Andrew, James, and the Gospel writer Mark, respectively. Now, I don't have time in today's sermon to go through this, but at some point in time, I'd like to go through Eastern Orthodox apostolic succession, because they don't have it either. They've got gaps, and they also change doctrine. But let's go into Linus. He's supposed to be the first bishop of Rome to take over from Peter. But if Clement was given the cathedra, it's clear that the first bishop of Rome didn't get it, so that causes a problem. The Catholic priest McBrien wrote, "Very little is known about Linus. Irenaeus and Eusebius identify him as a companion of Paul, who sent greetings from Rome to Timothy in Ephesus." You could look that up in 2 Timothy 4:21. But Scripture scholars generally are hesitant to do so. So people who looked at this said, we're not sure that this is the same Linus that was in the Bible. Eusebius has claimed that Linus held the office for about 12 years, but they're not clear about the exact dates or his exact role or authority. You should remember that, contrary to pious Catholic belief, the monarchical episcopal structure of church governance still did not exist in Rome at this time. So even though pious Catholics want to believe otherwise, Catholic priests and scholars say, look, it's just not true. Now, when I was in Rome, I bought a book called The Popes. It was written by a guy named Lopes and it's translated in English. And I got the 1997 edition. And this is actually what got me interested in looking at church history. I started to read through this, and I was, after I read a little bit about what he wrote about Linus and Cletus, I thought, where'd they get all this stuff? And later, I kind of said, when I did more research, I said, it looks like they made this up. And I thought, that doesn't seem so. That would be odd. But actually, they did. And so let me read something from that book that I bought in the Vatican, by the way, at a Vatican museum. Linus was the first to take up the inheritance of St. Peter. He made disposition for women to be admitted to holy places and attend functions with their head covered. Really? Is that true? Well, what does the Catholic scholars say, like an encyclopedia, like J.P. Kirsch? Here's what he wrote about him. The Liber Pontificalis asserts Linus' home was in Tuscany, and his father's name was Herculanus. But we can't discover the origins of this assertion. In other words, it might be made up. According to the same work of the popes, Linus is supposed to have issued a decree in conformity with the ordinance of St. Peter that women should have their heads covered in church. This is again from the Catholic Encyclopedia. Without doubt, this decree is apocryphal and copied by the author of the Liber Pontificalis from the first epistle of St. Paul to Corinthians, 11:5, and arbitrarily attributed to the first successor in Rome. The statement made in the same source that Linus suffered martyrdom cannot be proven and is improbable. For between Nero and Domitian, there is no mention of persecution of the Roman Church. And Irenaeus, from the early Roman bishops, designates only Telesphorus as a glorious martyr. So in other words, there was no evidence that Linus was martyred. This was something, though, that is commonly taught. It comes from the Liber Pontificalis, and that was not true. Now here's what John O'Malley, a Jesuit priest and Catholic historian, published. The earliest list of popes began not with Peter, but with a man named Linus. The reason Peter's name was not listed is because he was an apostle, which is a supercategory much superior to pope or bishop. The Catholic community of Rome, he's Christian, well in the 2nd century was operated as a collection of separate communities without a central structure. And by the way, I do believe that there were 2 Christians in Rome in the early 2nd century. But not all who claimed to be Christian in Rome were real Christians. Rome was a constellation of house churches independent of one another, each one of them loosely governed by an elder. The communities thus basically followed the pattern of the Jewish synagogues in which they developed. So in other words, there was not some kind of a pope or super authority at that time over all of Christendom. This is the way I was taught growing up as Catholic. It's just not true. Furthermore, let me read some things about that Priest Sullivan wrote. According to Irenaeus, Peter and Paul, not Peter alone, appointed Linus as the first in succession of bishops of Rome. This suggests that Irenaeus did not think of Peter and Paul as bishops or as Linus, and that those that followed as successors of Peter any more than successors of Paul. So again, the idea of the Church of Rome that all supposedly came from Peter or others, this is not the case. Further, it should be pointed out, it took about 100 years or so after he died before people started to claim he was some kind of a bishop. Now, there's another part, and this is kind of interesting, and this is also from the book, Lope's book, The Popes. Cletus or Anacletus, they give him 2 names, 76 to 88. He made dispositions for the consecration of bishops and dedicated the norms of ecclesiastical dress. He had a small chapel built over the tomb of St. Peter, which was the nucleus on which Constantine erected the great basilica in 324. Now I'm going to read about Cletus and Anacletus from the Liber Pontificalis. Cletus, by nationality, was a Roman from the precinct Vicis Patrias, or so of Aemilianus, occupied the see 7 years, 1 month, 20 days. He was bishop at the time of Vespasian and Titus. Anacletus was by nationality a Greek, so one's a Roman, one's a Greek, from Athens, son of Antiochus, occupied the see 12 years, 10 months, and 7 days. He was bishop in the time of Domitian, the 12th consulship. Yet one Catholic source says, and this is a Catholic encyclopedia, at present time no critic doubts that Cletus, Anacletus, and Anacletus are the same person. Anacletus is a Latin error. I mentioned that before, but the Liber Pontificalis says, oh no, one of them he was a Greek, and the other one he was a Roman. So this is not just a simple copying error. some of the information in the Liber Pontificalis, actually a lot of the early information, was made up. I don't know what sources they got it from. They disagree with one another. They contradict known historical records, and that's why most Catholic scholars who look into this realize it's not a reliable document. So somebody couldn't be from two different fathers and two different nationalities and be the same person. Here's what the Catholic scholar T.J. Campbell said in the Catholic Encyclopedia about Cletus or Anacletus, that he ordained a certain number of priests is nearly all we have. Now, and that's, if he existed, he probably did ordain some people, so I'm not going to argue that. But the other part, though, that he came up with ecclesiastical dress is simply not true. This is from the Catholic Encyclopedia. The liturgical vestments have by no means remained the same from the founding of the Church. So it doesn't come from the Bible the way the Catholic priests and pontiffs and bishops are dressed. There's a great difference between the vestments worn at Holy Sacrifice in the pre-Constantine period and even the following centuries. The era before Constantine, in that period, priestly dress did not differ from secular costume in form and ornament. So in other words, prior to the time of Constantine, the clergy looked like everybody else. They didn't have funny hats and they didn't wear these different vestments and such. So for a book that the Vatican is selling in the Vatican Museum to say, oh, by the way, Anacletus or Cletus, he's the one that came up with these garments that we have. Look, for back in the, the 1st century AD. That's not true. They say, oh, maybe they were only selling it at one time when you were there. No, when I was there in 2009, the book was there. It had a 2005 copyright date to 97, but I noticed that basically all they did was add Pope Benedict XVI, because he was in the book I had. They added him in there, but the first parts they didn't change at all. And they're selling books to people that have information that is not accurate, and that their scholars know are not accurate. Now, what about this idea about Peter's bones back then? Well, actually, this is another account from the Liber Pontificalis. Again, it may be inaccurate, but it says Cornelius, Pope from 251 to 53, during his pontificus, at the request of a certain martyr, Luciana, he took up the bodies of the apostles, blessed Peter and Paul, and brought them out of the catacombs by night. First, the body of blessed Paul was received by the blessed Lucina and laid down in the garden in Via Osiensis, near the place where he was beheaded. And the body of the blessed Peter was received by the blessed Cornelius, the bishop, and laid near the place he was crucified among the bodies of holy bishops in the shrine of Apollo on Mons Honorius in the Vatican by the palace of Nero on June 29th. So we've got, again, stories about Peter's body being moved or not being moved to different places in different times or different ones. Now, the Catholic Encyclopedia says this also about Anacletus. Whether he was the same as Cletus, who's also called Anacletus, has been the subject of endless discussion. Irenaeus, Eusebius, Augustine, Apatus use both names indifferently as one person. Tertullian admits them altogether. To add to the confusion, the order is different. Thus, Irenaeus has Linus, Anacletus, Clement, whereas Augustine and Apatus put Clement before Anacletus. On the other hand, the Liber Pontificalis, Catalogus Librianus, the Carmen contra Marcionum, all most respectable for the antiquity, not necessarily their content, make Cletus and Anacletus distinct from each other, while the Catalogus Felicianus sets down the latter as the Greek and the former as the Roman, which I've read that before. But is it necessary to be exact about the popes from whom we know so little? Well, it's not necessary except if you make claims about them. If you go out and teach people that this is true about them, you shouldn't do that. They shouldn't make claims about certain people they don't know is the truth. Now, listen to this part from the Catholic Encyclopedia. We can accept the list of Irenaeus, Linus, Anacletus, Clement, Evaristus, Alexandrus, Sixtus, Tillarius, Hyginus, Pius, and Anicetus. Anicetus reigned certainly in 154. That's all we can say with assurance about primitive pontifical chronology. So the only thing to know for sure, they claim, the Catholic Encyclopedia, is that Anicetus was in charge in 154. Well, actually, it looks like that's an error, because Loeb's book says it was 155 that he reigned until. So it was the one thing that they thought that they knew for sure. They're not even sure about that. Now, I talked about Clement, and I'm not going to go through huge amounts of details. But basically, it says, from the Catholic Encyclopedia again, Linus and Cletus each had 12 years attributed to them in the list. If Hippolytus found Cletus doubled in error, the ascension of Clement would have appeared to be 36 years after the death of the apostles. This would have made it almost impossible for Clement to be their contemporary. It might have caused Hippolytus to shift into an earlier position. In other words, their facts didn't agree, because if you add up how long these people were supposedly popes or bishops of Rome, it didn't agree. So we have this idea, again, about Clement. It doesn't agree with the facts. Interestingly, the Lope's book about the popes said that Clement appointed 7 notaries in the church at that time. Well, the Church of Rome wasn't large enough to have 7 notaries. If there were 7 notaries, you'd think there'd be all kinds of written records and stuff that we would have found about him. But that's not the case. There's also a claim about him having to do with the vestments in Lope's book, which again is not true. Let me read something from the Catholic Encyclopedia regarding Bishop Stephen from 254 to 257. In his days, the vestments worn by the clergy at Mass and other church services did not differ in shape or material from those ordinarily worn by the laity. So the idea that somehow Clement came up with the dress, which he didn't do it, and Cletus didn't do it either, should send off warning signals to people who claim to be following the Church of Rome. Every time you see how their people are dressed, I'm talking about the Pope or the bishops, or most of the time the way the priests are dressed, that was not the way the apostles dressed. That was not a tradition of the apostles. It was not something that the Bible taught. So the dress alone should give us an idea. So that might be why various sources went out and started claiming, oh, this guy did this part of the dress, this guy this other part of the dress. And that's simply not the case. Now, another claim is that we supposedly have a writing from Clement. There's a letter to the Corinthians, which is called First Clement, and basically people believe that this particular letter proves that the Church of Rome was in charge and that Clement was the guy and all that kind of stuff. Well, first of all, it's an anonymous letter. It doesn't say who wrote it. And let me read some comments from Priest Sullivan about it. In the past, Catholic writers have interpreted this intervention as an exercise of Roman primacy, but is now generally recognized as a kind of exhortation one church could address to another without any claim of authority. One Clement certainly does not support the theory that before the apostles died, they appointed one man as bishop in each of the churches they founded. And I agree. The letter witnesses rather the fact that in the last decades of the first century, a collegial ministry of a group of presbyters was maintained in the Pauline Church of Corinth, and most likely this was the case in Rome for the same period. That's from pages 91 and 101 from his book, From Apostles to Bishops. Now, it's interesting that during the time of all these so-called successors of Peter, the Apostle John was alive. Now, according to the records I've looked at, now they are later reports, so they're not super close. It may well be that the Apostle John was sent to Rome around this time, and that's what the records suggest. It could be that First Clement, which they call it, which is actually the letter of the Corinthians, from the Romans to the Corinthians, was in response to a letter from the Corinthians to Rome. The Corinthians wrote a letter to Rome asking for advice on a particular matter. And they may have sent it to Rome for a couple of reasons, but the main reason probably was that the Apostle John had been to Rome. He was imprisoned there. According to certain legend, they were going to try to kill him. They tried to boil him in oil, and that didn't work. And because that didn't work, they took him from Rome and they exiled to the Isle of Patmos. And there's a couple of writings about this. Tertullian wrote about it, and it's also in a sort of a questionable book called The Life of Polycarp. But there are some accounts of this, that John was in Rome. Well, if John was in Rome, that could very well explain why the Corinthians sent a letter to Rome, because John is considered to be the last apostle who died, and if they wanted to go to who was considered the top person, that's where he was for at that time. But he could have left there because, again, he got exiled, and by the time the Church of Rome had this letter, they didn't know what to do with it. They just wrote it back and said, look, here's our advice. We're not sure what to tell you. And they wrote, the Church of Rome actually wrote in this letter called First Clement, it happens because of the sudden repeated misfortunes and reverses which have happened to us. They delayed responding. In other words, I think it's because John had been there. John was who the letter probably was supposed to go to, but since John abruptly was transferred, those in Rome had a letter and said, look, we're going to respond to it, but we don't really have any authority over you. So, do the right thing. And then Priest Sullivan again goes out regarding this letter. He says, most scholars are of the opinion that the Church of Rome would most probably have also been led at that time by a group of presbyters. And I agree. And that's why they only responded with their opinion. Then there's another thing I'd like to mention, and this is from a Catholic writer, Stephen Ray. There is no clear statement in either Clement or Ignatius in the form of a dogmatic pronouncement of Rome's primacy. That just was not the case. There's one named Evaristus, supposedly had 7 deacons whose job it was to write down 7 utterances. Again, that's from Lope's Book of the Popes. There's no written record of anything from this guy. And you say, oh, you're just saying that. No, this is the Catholic Encyclopedia says. The earliest historical sources offer no authentic data about him. Okay. There's also some stuff about Alexander and Sixtus. Sixtus, according to Edmund Duffy, he suggested that name was just made up because he was the 6th, and he may not even existed. So the Church of Rome claims to have this unbroken succession, but we don't have proof of succession to succession, and some of these people may not have even existed. Duffy also said, everything we know about the Church of Rome during its first 100 years confirms this general picture, a loose constellation of churches meeting in private houses, or as time went on, the community met in rented halls. Now in the Bible, the Apostle John wrote about Rome. Now if the Apostle John thought that Rome was supposed to be the place, you'd think he would have said. If the Apostle John thought people should be subservient to the Bishop of Rome, you'd think he would have said. And actually, if you go to the book of Revelation, chapter 17, 4 through 9, he writes some things about a religious power in Rome, and it's not good. Now I've got pages of references from Catholic scholars that say that John was writing about Rome. And what he was writing about Rome was not good. And the reason all this is important is because according to the current Catholic list, after Peter died, you had Linus, then you had Cletus or Anacletus, then you've got Clement, then you have Evaristus. But the Apostle John was alive during this whole time. Does anyone really think the Apostle John was subservient to the Bishop of Rome? Not Catholics that I tend to talk to, but oddly, most Catholics don't know this. And one of the reasons I find one thing's kind of odd is when I visited the Vatican last time, or the Vatican, I visited both, and I think it's in both places, they had statues that were supposed to be the apostles. And Peter is shown to be a person in his 50s, approximately, but John looks like a young man, like he's in his 20s. But the reality is, John probably lived to be about 100. So he was considered the authority, and he appointed various ones to be in charge of the church in different areas. And one of the ones that he put in charge was a guy by the name of Polycarp. And this is important because if you go through the writings of so-called Apostolic Fathers, and I mentioned the writings of Ignatius, he wrote to a bunch of different cities. They all had bishops, except Rome. He didn't say they have a bishop. And he basically said that Polycarp was the bishop of the church. And then actually after Polycarp died, there's another writing in the Apostolic Fathers called the Martyrdom of Polycarp, and it said he was the bishop of the Catholic Church. Now I've used the term Church of God a couple times. I should mention that when Ignatius was writing, he frequently referred to the churches as the Church of God, like the Church of God in Smyrna, for example. And here's one of those terms. Ignatius, who's called Theophorus, to the Church of God, which is in Smyrna in Asia, and that's his letter to Ignatius. Ignatius was also called Theophorus to Polycarp, bishop of the church of the Smyrnians. or rather, who was as his own bishop, God the Father and Lord Jesus Christ. So in other words, you've got this idea that Polycarp was considered to be a leader who had some kind of succession. The Catholic Encyclopedia says basically this idea of various communities having bishops. Because of Ignatius, we know Asia Minor did and Jerusalem did. Other communities, there is no mention made of a monarchic episcopate until the middle of the 2nd century. So a lot of Catholic scholars have known that, again, they don't have this idea of succession from that time period. I'd like to read something from Priest McBrien, and I've got similar quotes from others, but for the sake of time, I won't go through it. Although Catholic tradition beginning in the late 2nd, early 3rd centuries regards Peter as the first bishop of Rome and therefore as first pope, there is no evidence that Peter was involved in the initial establishment of the Christian community in Rome. Indeed, what evidence there would seem to be points the opposite direction, or that he serves as Rome's first bishop. Not until the pontificate of St. Pius in the middle of the 2nd century, 142 to 155, did the Roman Church have monepiscopal structure of government, one bishop as pastoral leader of a diocese. Those who Catholic tradition lists as Peter's immediate successors, Linus, Anacletus, Clement, did not function as the one bishop of Rome. And other scholars have said the same thing, including, by the way, Cardinal Walter Casper, who said that it was to stand in the apostolic succession is not a matter of individual historical chain, but of collegial membership in a collegium. So that's from Cardinal Walter Casper, who, as I do this sermon, I think I'm pretty sure he's still alive. So we know this. Now what about Polycarp? It says Polycarp, this is from Irenaeus, maintained he was bound to adhere to the usage of the presbyters who succeeded him. Polycarp was faithful. Polycarp was in Asia Minor. The Catholic Encyclopedia said that John had a prominent position in the apostolic body. The apostle and evangelist John lived in Asia Minor in the last decades of the 1st century, and from Ephesus he guided the churches from that province. So the Catholic Encyclopedia is admitting that the apostle John was alive when a lot of their bishops, so-called bishops of Rome, existed. And McBrien also wrote down that unlike Peter, the Pope is neither an apostle nor an eyewitness to the risen Lord, and that's true. And again, I don't believe that the apostle John would have been subservient. We in the Church of God believe that the apostles did ordain people, and that there were some early faithful Christians in Rome, but we don't believe this idea of all these lists, these people were Roman Catholic bishops the way we now understand them. Look, people like Linus and Anacletus and Clement very well be, or have been, part of the true Church of God, but again, their idea that they were the top leaders of the entire of Christendom just is not there. Because at that stage, the leadership positions would have been the top one, if there was one, would be held by the Apostle John, and I think there was one, by the way. And as far as Polycarp, as Irenaeus wrote, Polycarp was not only instructed by the apostles and conversed with many who had seen Christ, but was also by apostles in Asia appointed bishop of the church in Smyrna. He always taught the things which he had learned from the apostles, which the church has handed down, which alone are true. Now this is important because he had apostolic succession. Polycarp, this says the apostles ordained Polycarp. We do not have that regarding others. We don't have this regarding Clement or Linus. That's simply a later invention. Now, interestingly, Tertullian said there were two groups, basically, at his time that he thought had succession. He said the Church of Rome, which had it claimed it from Peter through Clement to present. So by the end of the 2nd century, the Church of Rome was claiming having some kind of succession. And he said the Smyrnians have succession, and they count it from John and Polycarp. So those who like to say, well, there's got to be some type of succession. Well, there was some type of succession, but it was in Asia Minor. It was with Polycarp, the one who we clearly know was appointed by the apostles. Now, the historical record written by Eusebius includes a letter from Polycarp. And Polycarp wrote that John fell asleep in Ephesus, then there was Polycarp, then there was Thrasius, then there was Segerus, then Papirius, then Melito, and then Polycarp. And all these leaders kept the same practices as the Apostle John as well as the Apostle Philip, that they believed in the Bible, that they did things with the Bible, that the Bible said. And that's where you had true succession in terms of early leaders. I was going to go through some stuff on papal infallibility, but I'll simply say that you'll find in the early centuries, when the idea first started to come out, popes disagreed with this idea that there was papal infallibility. And that I mention that only because there were a lot of corrupt popes. And again, this is not Catholic bashing. If you look through Catholic accepted records, you'll find out that some seemed to buy the office, and some were messing around with women, and political intrigue and all this kind of stuff was going on. Certainly non-Christian behavior. Certainly not following the apostles Peter and Paul as they followed Christ. So they didn't have that type of succession. But in the Church of God, we don't accept as leaders those who bought their office. And if anyone bought their office, there's no way that we feel that God recognized them. Now, I'd like to make a few concluding comments, because there's a difference between the perception of the Church of Rome and the reality of the Church of Rome versus the Church of God. The Bible itself never speaks of Rome in a manner suggesting its supremacy. And the historical evidence does not show that Peter spent much of any time in Rome. There are a lot of early lists of bishops, so-called bishops of Rome, that don't agree with one another. The Bishop of Rome didn't get the title of Pope until sometime like the late 4th century, and that's after the pagan emperors stopped having it. Much about what's taught about the early lives of the early bishops, or the lives of the early so-called bishops of Rome, simply is not true. It doesn't agree with the facts. The writings of the so-called Apostolic Fathers, by the way, do not show a Roman primacy. As a matter of fact, they tend to show a primacy to Polycarp and the Church of God in Smyrna. I won't go into much more detail about this, but the first time the term Catholic Church was used, by the way, was by Ignatius, and that was referring to the Church of God in Smyrna. And the second time the term Catholic Church was used was for the Church of God in Smyrna. The Church of Rome took that title later, and later it was enforced by the Emperor Theodosius in the late 4th century. Actual Catholic scholars who are interested in truth will realize that there's no firm evidence that Peter was a bishop. They know that Paul didn't found the Church of Rome. There's no evidence that Peter or Paul directly transmitted their authority to Linus. The identity of Cletus, Anacletus, and Anancletus is unclear for centuries and contains contradictions. The letter attributed to Clement is not authoritative. There certainly were no certain bishop of Rome until the middle of the 2nd century, and I think Anicetus actually is the first sure one. But the idea that there would be successful teaching by leaders does exist. But it was in Asia Minor with people such as Polycarp and Thrasius and Segerus and Polycarp, and that's what the historical records show. Most Catholic and other scholars of history who look at it in great depth know that the church in Asia Minor had succession, but they don't tend to emphasize it because they don't have the teachings. They don't hold to the original teachings that the church had, but we, the continuing Church of God, do. The Bible, early church history, and truthful Catholic scholars teach that Rome simply did not have the type of succession that most Catholics think it had. The Apostle John did appoint people such as Polycarp, that those teachings that Polycarp and his successors had were apostolic. And those who want to follow the Church of God from the Bible and understand true history should support the church that has kept the original teachings, who has a type of apostolic succession, the type where it still has the same teachings, and can point to leaders that were appointed by the apostles and were faithful to the teachings of the apostles. And that's the Church of God, not the Church of Rome.